All right, so I'm going to cue off my images here and speak to you, tell you a little bit about Gage Brewer and his life, and why he's so important. He's why we're having the symposium here at the museum, because he lived and worked in Wichita and introduced the electric guitar to the world through its first performances here in 1932. But let's look back at his life because it's quite interesting. I'm going to be speaking contemporaneously, really, not from a script, and telling you just about where things begin. And here they begin with his parents in Gage, Oklahoma, for which he was named Gage Brewer. These are the Brewers, about the time of his birth, 1904. And here we have a view of Gage, Oklahoma at that time. Now, Gage, Oklahoma is located near the panhandle of Oklahoma. It is not far by today's standards from Wichita, just maybe 3 hours drive from here. Very similar terrain, very similar culture. Oklahoma was still at that time known as Oklahoma Territory. It wasn't until 5 years after his birth that it became a state. The main street of Gage, Oklahoma looked much like streets in Kansas. And we're fortunate that it's well documented. This is about the time of his birth, in the early part of the century. You can see horse-drawn vehicles. You can see even an automobile there that helps date the picture a little bit. So this is what he knew. This is where Gage grew up. It wasn't long before they moved to Shattuck, down the road from Gage, and this is where Gage came of age. He worked in the Shattuck Theater, and he encountered traveling Hawaiian musicians, among others, and was really taken up with the Hawaiian guitar. This would have been about the beginning of World War I, and through those years, 1914 to 1918, so about 100 years ago now. By the time Gage became a teenager, he was also Shattuck's big star. He performed, and he took correspondence courses to learn how to play the Hawaiian guitar, where you take a Spanish-style standard guitar and you lay it across your lap and play it with a bar. And it led to what we know today as the steel guitar sound, very prominent now in country music. But Hawaiian music was the rage in the early part of the century. He took correspondence courses. He traveled. He was a real enthusiast and a devotee of all the Hawaiian guitars he could find. There was also some saw playing. This is sort of an aside. Very similar sound, and I'll get back to saw playing here in a few minutes. Gage put together a group, and they would play at the auto dealership. They'd move the cars out on Saturdays and have dances in the auto dealership and charge money. His group from about that period. Gage developed this group. This is by the time he moved to Wichita in the mid-1920s, but his interest in this music did not wane, obviously. One of his early teachers was Sam Moore, who was known for playing the saw and had hits on Victor Records, and was also a Hawaiian guitar, steel guitar enthusiast, and this is inscribed to Gage from his teacher, Sam Moore. Gage printed up cards and started giving lessons. He moved to Alva to attain a degree in music so that he could be a teacher, specializing in the Hawaiian guitar. This is his class from Alva, Oklahoma, at the Teachers College there. He's moved a little closer to Kansas at this point. That's Gage on the far right. Gage corresponded with different teachers, and he eventually made trips. His family had connections in Mattoon, Illinois, so he was not isolated there in Oklahoma. He soon traveled to Los Angeles, where he became friends with Saul Hoopy, who is seated there playing Hawaiian guitar. Saul Hoopy is known as a second-generation steel guitarist, and really was probably the best known in the United States. He appeared in some films. Here's one, that's Saul in the center. Saul was a lifelong friend of Gage's and came to Wichita to perform. Here's a Columbia 78. It was a direct-to-disc recording, a test disc done in the Columbia studios, and Saul had inscribed several of these and sent them to Gage. Some of these are, one of these is in the museum's collection currently. When Gage moved to Wichita in the mid-20s, the town looked about like this. It was a population of around 50,000. I believe at that point Wichita was Kansas's largest city. There in the center of the picture is the castle-like building, which was the city hall, and where we are recording this and where the museum exists today. To the left in this image of City Hall is the tall building which was the Beacon newspaper building. That's where the famous picture, we'll look at it in a moment, from Gage's electric guitar debut was taken. Oh, here's a good image of his card. Learn to play that music of weird character and irresistible charm on the most fascinating of all musical instruments, the Hawaiian steel guitar. Gage and his group in Wichita appeared on a cover of Fret's magazine in 1927. Gage was just about ready to quit using his Gibson and Martin acoustic guitars and transition into the new national steel resonator guitars being developed in Los Angeles. Here they are with their acoustic, wooden acoustic instruments, including the big bass mandolin in the back. And Gage in the lower right, seated playing the Hawaiian style. Gage met about this time Solomon Moses, and I cannot pronounce Solomon's last name. I need some help, perhaps from Dr. Troutman, but it is Solomon Moses Kewai. That was my best shot at it. Was a Victor recording artist known as the Great Hawaiian Baritone, and he came to the United States in 1912 or so to appear in the Broadway production of Bird of Paradise. He was a member of that Hawaiian musicians troupe, and Gage had talked Old Mose, as he was known here in Wichita, to perform in his group. There's the Bird of Paradise. It really popularized Hawaiian music nationally and led to the Hawaiian craze. There were productions of this on into the mid-century. Here's the whole group. That's Old Mose on the left, about 1912. And to note, Mose died in a car accident in 1931 here locally, and is buried in Wichita. His gravesite is located not far from Gage's in in an adjoining cemetery. So here's Gage and his guitarist and Mose on the ukulele here in Wichita. Here on the left is George Beecham, his brother, and another accompanist. Same period, playing Hawaiian music. George is going to factor into the story here in a moment. George is a Texan operating out of Los Angeles. Gage is a Oklahoman operating out of Wichita, Kansas. George Beecham developed with the Dopiera brothers in Los Angeles an extra loud guitar they stamped out of metal and put speaker-like cone resonators inside to amplify the sound. It was these were loud guitars. They came out in about 1927, preceding the electric guitar. The company took off, and Gage was a big purchaser of these, as was his local Wichita competitor, June Frisbee. They had competing music studios. So here's Gage's group now outfitting themselves primarily with the National Steel guitars, the National Resophonic guitars from Los Angeles. We'll switch to Gage's house. This is Gage Brewer's home on South Topeka here in Wichita. I love the neon street number. He needed that because this is where he operated his studio, the Hawaiian Studio of Music. Inside the home was replete with all sorts of exotic decor. His wife Doris was a piano teacher, and so they had quite the business. They would entertain, they would have students there. Here's Gage with his students. This is obviously prior to the advent of the national guitars, so probably 1926, 1927. His adult students and his children's students. Now here, this might be a year or so after, because you'll see that they're playing the Resophonic Nationals. Well, it was just a few years before George Beecham introduced a new idea, and that was an electrically amplified guitar with increased volume that far outstepped his Resophonic guitars. And he introduced these in the summer of 1932, and Gage was first in line to get one of these. Went to Los Angeles and came back with two: a Hawaiian model, which is a cast aluminum steel guitar, Hawaiian guitar played on the lap, and a Spanish standard guitar made out of wood. And we'll examine those more closely in a minute. This appeared in the Beacon newspaper October 2nd, 1932, announcing that this new invention would take the world by storm. Here's the article. He has the Hawaiian model up above his now outmoded acoustic national guitar and the amplifier used to amplify the small Hawaiian fry pan, they called them, guitars. He sent out press releases. He had a series of shows, all with a Halloween theme across town, and invited people to come hear the sensational new instrument, the amplified electro guitars. Here's that instrument he would have brought with him in September, I'm expecting. I don't think he wasted time getting this out before the public. This was the standard Spanish guitar that you would play in the conventional way. And it's a prototype of what would become later that year a production guitar. It's recognized widely as the first really functional electric guitar that would have carried on. There was a competing company, Vivitone, out of Michigan, that was pursuing a different path to an amplified guitar, and their design was not successful or carried forward, and we have not found an example from that era to exist, but we have found some reference to it in print. There was also another similar one in 1928 from the Stromberg-Vossinet company out of Chicago, later known as the Cale Guitar Company, where they had tried a similar thing to amplify guitars, but they were approaching it in a whole different way that really was not feasible. So none of those earlier brands exist, but once this was developed, this took off and became what we know today as the guitar. The company is still in business. It is Rickenbacker Guitar Company, operating out of the Los Angeles area in California today. Here's a close-up of that guitar. There's no acoustic qualities to this guitar. The top is an inch thick. It's just an armature to hold strings and that big silver pickup you see there, which was an electromagnet pickup. It picked up, it registered the vibrations of metal strings and then translated that into electrical signal. Earlier attempts had been trying to translate a vibrating wooden top into electrical signal with much less success. This actually works, and this is when you buy an electric guitar today, the same technology. Their early ads from their first catalog would sell you a set. Of course, you wanted to buy the amplifier because neither the fry pan or the Spanish had any acoustic qualities. There's the Spanish. They were $175. They referred to the amplifier simply as the speaker. Gage took these and performed in a club that was located on South Highway 81 called Shadowlands. And he performed there with these instruments early on. He has on stage by now his aluminum frying pan, but also a couple of production instruments branded as electros on either side there, and the amplifier. Wasn't enough to have Gage's excellent music. You needed dancers and contortionists to augment any show, apparently. You'll also see his resonator guitar next to him. He's seated there playing the saxophone in this picture. He was a multi-instrumentalist, but that resonator has the Rickenbacker horseshoe pickup now mounted in it. All these instruments in this picture were lost in a 1935 fire at this club that totally destroyed everything he had, except for the original, which I think was relegated to his studio at home. We're fortunate because it really is the earliest example of these instruments. Another shot in the club. They liked themed. Here's a theme, sort of a, well, I'm going to call it a barnyard theme. Here's Gage playing in a theater setting, playing his Hawaiian electro. He usually relegated the standard guitar playing to a second guitarist, such as the fellow on the left, Floyd Dalrymple, who's playing the electro Spanish. Gage has his custom Tricone National with the Rickenbacker pickup in it, and he's got the frying pan sitting next to him there. Another shot of the same session. He took this show on the road. Here he is in Oklahoma playing at an oil and gas convention. When he came back the next year, he's sort of moved on from the electros. Because Rickenbacker had started this electric guitar business, but within just a few years, there was a lot of competition, and people started to climb on board. By 1936, there were many producing these. Even the established guitar companies like Gibson was up and running with electrically amplified guitars. Gage published music, little sheet music. He published 3 that we know about. He also took his show on the road in these fine vehicles parked out in front of his house. There's his group. His group was ever evolving. It's not easy to keep a band of musicians together. He traveled coast to coast. This is a shot in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel, Coconut Grove, where he is documented to have performed. Another shot of that, you can almost see it happening. He also played on the East Coast. He played in New York City's Arcadia Theater, we happen to know as well. He made it around. He played a lot. He never became a star because he didn't record music. He was of the variety of musicians that thought, he was very modern. He thought, well, I can play with fewer people for more people and earn more money that way, and if I make records, who's going to come out and see us? So that was the direction I think that he took. He did play over the radio. This is at a radio station, I believe in Denver, Colorado. And it was in Denver. He did do one direct disc recording that we know about, and it's now in the museum's collection. We've put that record on YouTube so you can hear it, and it's quite interesting. It may well be the earliest record with both electrically amplified Spanish and Hawaiian guitars. I don't know that, I think this was a later trip because he's playing a different, a later steel guitar. But here is that record. He recorded it was an old song, an old jazz standard called "A Good Man Is Hard to Find." In Wichita, Gage really ignited a lot of enthusiasm for electric instruments and fostered the enthusiasm for the Hawaiian instruments. One of those people that was in Wichita at that time was Lowell Kiesel, who later went to Los Angeles. I believe perhaps at Gage's suggestion, introducing himself to people in Los Angeles and eventually starting what was called the Carvin Guitar Company, electric guitar company, now known as the Kiesel Guitar Company. It's in its 3rd generation of building guitars in Los Angeles. But Lowell got his guitar start here in Wichita, playing on the radio, and may have been a student of Gage's, certainly an acquaintance, no doubt, and possibly of June Frisbee's. We still need to research that with the Kiesel family who have Lowell's diaries. Lowell, I am guessing, I surmise, has met George Beecham on one of these visits. George Beecham ended up passing away in 1940, but according to this story, Beecham himself installed the Kiesel pickup you see there on his National Resonator guitar. Why waste a perfectly good unamplified guitar when you can put a pickup on it? And this is a Kiesel pickup. This is one of George Beecham's instruments. Well, Gage's successes were so good that he ended up buying the Shadowland Dance Club and relocating it after the fire to North Hillside. And this building still exists today. He operated this club at this location from 1936 until about 1950 when he changed the name to the Mambo Club, and then operated the Mambo Club into the early 60s, and then finally sold the building. Here's an aerial view of that. Oddly, you know, poignantly, Gage is buried across the street in the cemetery there from this club. We've got lots of documentation from the Shadowland. It was a very popular club. They advertised profusely. Gage Brewer was an amazing marketer, a very zealous marketer and entrepreneur. So it's fascinating to see through the years the changes the club went through. This is about 1936. Gage is playing a Gibson Hawaiian electric guitar, which is in the museum's collection now. You still see his frying pan guitar there. He had two frying pan guitars. I think the first one was probably destroyed in the fire, and he acquired a second one later. He also has Gibsons and Nationals outfitted for amplification on this stage, 1936. Same stage, little different night. I guess they never got tired of the barnyard theme. They'd trot that out occasionally, complete with live animals. I don't know. There they are. a little more formal this evening. Of course, they changed the backdrop. They've got a sort of a tropical scene painted there. We're closing in on the era of the Mambo Club, though. He's still using amplifiers from the 1930s. This could be about 1940. Now it's a little more casual. They've got the Hawaiian shirts on. Gage, I'm going back to this. The pianist on the left remains to be identified, but he is an African-American fellow, and this was quite unusual in this time to have mixed bands like that, mixed musicians. But Gage, in the spirit of music, was, to a certain extent anyway, blind to those segregation rules. Here's another picture of his group, and decked out in formal attire, used for this piece of sheet music that I think came from the late 30s. The guys in front of the truck again. The groupe de jour. It's impossible to identify everyone in these pictures. His glamour shot with the printed autograph for your collection. Also used in other promotions. That's one of his best known portraits. Here it is in the newspaper. In 1940, Gage and his wife Doris went to Tahiti and hobnobbed with all the great people of Tahiti, including the artist Edgar Latigue, who he came back with several paintings for his home. There he is in his home in Tahiti. He lived there for the better part of a year. He and Doris. Every night in Tahiti's like this. That's he and Doris again. And from that came this piece of sheet music, 1940. The war broke that up. And the war broke up a lot of things, including the manufacture of electric guitar. There is from 1940 to almost 1950, there's very little happening with the development of the electric guitar in terms of production. But it was something that, thanks to Charlie Christian and Les Paul, really catching fire as its own instrument. By 1950 or so, he changed the name of the club to the Mambo Club. There's their sign, and I am told that the hands were flashing to move like the drummer was playing that particular drum. Gage, again, was a multi-instrumentalist. Here he is playing the maracas. and with his group. By this time, Gage was bringing in different acts, and he that in itself is an interesting study of. But primarily, it was his own orchestra. Here he is with an artist hired to decorate the walls of the Mambo Club. Some of these paintings, still remnants of them exist in that building. These are pictures probably from the early 50s. Gage was in a waning part of his career now in the 50s. He would hire student players from the nearby Wichita State University, Wichita University called in those days. And these are some of those students. I've talked with a few of them. He made very glamorous promises to them to get them to do this, but the hours were long and hard, and fame and fortune really didn't follow these gigs. There's Gage, and by this time he has a later model Rickenbacker guitar that he's playing through. Again, subbing out the standard guitar playing to another musician. A little dressier version of that same outfit. This must have been a gay 90s night, I think, at the Shadowlands, or perhaps Mambo Club by now. Another interior shot. We're fortunate to have all these photos. Sadly, the club looks nothing like this anymore. I believe today it operates as a church. It's been vacant a lot. We could about open it back up if it were intact. Here we are. That is Matthew Hill and Arian Sheets. Matthew is an organologist and working from the University of Edinburgh, and Arian Sheets is the conservator at the National Musical Instrument Museum in Vermillion, South Dakota. We invaded Shadowlands one day. We got the keys to go in and see what was happening. It just ceased to be a church. But the lights were still on, so the landlord let us look around. So you can kind of see a little bit. I think they're standing about in that corner today. We're fortunate to have them again with us. More pictures of the Shadowland. I mean, Mambo, you can tell by the menu. I want one of those menus. Now, in the 50s, Gage would book the African American groups that were traveling through and open up the club to that whole clientele. And while it wasn't officially segregated, you wouldn't turn anyone away at the door. It was primarily African American patrons from the nearby community that would come and see these groups. So it was really kind of a biracial operation. Great Amos Milburn played there, Ruth Brown, and even the Supremes played there in 1962, I believe. There's some more photos taken inside the club. This would have been not one of the African American groups playing that night. In fact, this looks like dance lessons, which they specialized in there. Clientele from the nearby McConnell Air Force Base, no doubt. and Gage with his good buddy Nick Lucas. Now, Nick Lucas attained really wide fame and is recognized as an early jazz guitarist. Obviously, they're friends. To my pal and friend Gage, sincerely, Nick Lucas. And there's a picture of Gage in his later years. This is about the time he was starting to get away from doing music. His last publicized gig was New Year's Eve 1962, where he was introducing a new dance called the Peppermint Twist. So he wanted you to hear that song, and that was his big drawing card. We find no record of him performing after that. Instead, Gage branched off into some other different ventures, selling encyclopedias, for example. He moved down to Alamo, Texas part of the year and opened a fruit business. He would send out fruit from Alamo, Texas. This is his business, sort of Harry and David, 1960. And he opened a drugstore. He became also a Borden's ice cream representative and a hypnotist as well. Those are Gage's hypnotizing glasses. I have some good stories relayed to me by people Gage has hypnotized. And so I'm going to conclude with that. And thank you for listening to my version of Gage's life story told through the pictures and images we found. Thank you.